By the middle of July, Lake Havasu City sits at 118 degrees, and Verlie Threadgill had not eaten in 2 days. She had knocked on 11 doors that morning. 10 belonged to people who were back in Minnesota until October, and she knew it, and she knocked anyway. The 11th had a walkway buried under 4 inches of monsoon silt, baked hard as poured cement, gravel shoved up against the step in a wave. Nobody had gone in or out of that door in weeks. Her hands had started trembling around 10 that morning, and it was not fear. The door opened 6 inches. The man behind it was old, 79, though she would not learn that for another day, and thin in a manner that frightened her, because she knew exactly what that kind of thin meant. She had watched it happen to her own face in a storage unit mirror off Acoma. Verlie pointed at the buried walkway with her chin. "I'll clear that for you. All of it, down to the concrete. I don't want money." The old man said nothing at all. "A piece of bread," she said. "That's it. That's the whole price." He looked past her at the silt. He looked at her shoes, split along one side, closed again with fishing line. Then he told her the thing that took her legs out from under her. "I don't have any bread." His hand stayed on the doorframe, and it was trembling worse than hers. "I haven't been able to buy a loaf of bread since the 9th of June. Verlie stared at him. "Why not?" "Because on the 9th of June, Hollis Ostrander said, somebody looked at a dead man's face and told the county it was mine. And the county believed him. 3 things were true in that doorway, and they could not all be true at once. The man in front of her was breathing. The house behind him was his, paid off in 1994, his name on the deed at the county recorder, and every computer in Arizona said he had been dead 6 weeks. His Social Security had stopped. His bank had closed his accounts and mailed the balance to an estate that did not exist. The power company shut his meter off on the 29th of June. In Arizona, in summer, which is not an inconvenience, it is a death sentence with a delay built in. And a claim had been filed against his life insurance, filed by the man who signed the paperwork. And a code enforcement notice was zip-tied to his gate, because a buried walkway is what an abandoned house looks like from the street. "Now get off my property." His voice cracked on it. "Don't touch that silt. Don't let anybody see you standing here. You understand me? Walk away." Verlie walked away hungry. She made it 4 blocks in 118 degrees before she stopped in the shade of a shuttered bait shop and worked out the part that would not leave her alone. A man that weak, that starved, that close to the end, and the last thing he spent his strength on was making her leave fast. Nobody throws a stranger off a property they have already lost. He wasn't chasing her off. He was warning her. Here is what Verlie had in the whole world that morning. A storage unit off Acoma with a mattress in it. $11. A plastic sack of clothes and a hose spigot behind a closed bait shop that still ran, which is the difference between a person who is struggling and a person who is finished. Anybody who has lived it knows that. What she did not have was proof that she existed. In April, she had gone to the emergency room at 3 in the morning with a kidney infection that had climbed into her back and turned her legs to water. They treated her. They were kind about it. 6 weeks later, the bill came for $1,180. When she could not pay, the collection firm took her to court, and the court set a hearing for 8:30 on the 12th of June. That same morning, a rental on Riviera Drive needed a turnover clean between guests. It paid $95 cash, and her unit rent was due on the 15th. So Verlie cleaned the house, and a judge in Kingman signed a bench warrant for her failure to appear. She had a warrant out on her for being too poor to attend a hearing about being too poor. Then, on the 20th of June, she left her car overnight in a posted lot off McCulloch because she had nowhere else to put it. It was gone by morning. The tow fee was $340, and it climbed another $35 for every day it sat there. Inside that car, her birth certificate, her Social Security card, her expired driver's license, her mother's photographs in a shoebox, every document that proved she was a person sat behind a fee she could not pay. The only way to get the money was work. Every job asked for the documents. She had spent 4 years becoming invisible one form at a time. She understood exactly what had happened to that old man, because it had happened to her, only slower. If you have ever had to choose between paying a bill and eating that week, type the words "I know" in the comments. Let's see how many of us there are. She went back the next morning at 5:40, before the heat had teeth. She was on the sidewalk with a scrap of plywood in her hands when the mail truck slowed and a woman leaned out of it. Ozella Greer had carried that route 11 years. She could tell you which houses were empty for the season and which were lying about it. She looked at the plywood, then at the buried walkway, and her face changed. Don't. She put the truck in park without pulling to the curb. Whatever you're about to do on that property, don't do it. Verlie kept her grip on the plywood. Man's got silt to his step. That house has a stop on the mail. Since the 16th of June. You know what a stop is? It means somebody told the post office the resident is deceased. I've been holding his catalogs in a tub at the annex for a month. Her hand went out toward the gate. There's a code enforcement tag on that lot, and a notice of abandonment coming behind it. Anybody they catch standing on it is a trespasser, and I don't know your situation, but I know how you're standing, and a charge is the last thing you need. He is alive. Ozella went still. What? He opened the door yesterday. Talked to me. Told me to run. Verlie shifted the plywood to her other hand. He's in there right now with no power in July. Ozella looked at that house for a long moment, and her jaw worked, and she reached down, picked a sealed bottle of water off the console, and held it out the window. I never gave you that, she said. I'm a federal employee, and this is a route with a stop on it. Whatever you're doing, do it fast and do it early. She put the truck in gear. And that man's name has been in this town a lot longer than yours. Watch who you say it to. It took Verlie 3 hours and 40 minutes to clear that walkway. The silt had cured in the sun into something between clay and concrete. She broke it with the plywood edge and hauled it out in a bucket from behind the shed. 41 buckets. And by the second hour, both palms had opened up, so she wrapped them in a dish towel and kept going. All of it for a piece of bread she already knew did not exist. She did it anyway. Verlie had been walked past by every institution in that county for 4 years. And here was one thing left in the world she could still fix with her own 2 hands. At 9:15 she knocked. Nobody came. At 9:20 she went around the side and put her face to the sliding glass door. The heat rolling off it was so thick she flinched back. Inside, the house was 108 degrees. Hollis Ostrander was on the floor. The slider was unlocked. Of course it was. A man with no power and no phone has nothing left to protect. She got him sitting against the couch and poured Ozella's water into him a swallow at a time. And when he tried to push the bottle away, she held it there and told him to quit being proud at her. She had walked 4 blocks in this heat, and he was going to drink it. That was when she saw the wristband. A hospital band, plastic, hanging loose enough on his arm to slide over the knuckle of his thumb. Filthy. 6 weeks old. And the name printed on it was not his. Ostrom H. Verlie read it out loud, and something cold moved through her in a 108-degree room. Who is Ostrom? Hollis pulled his arm back against his chest like she had reached for a wallet. That's mine. That's not your name. It is now. He got his breath. It's the only piece of paper in this world with my body attached to it. You want to know what I am? I've been carrying a dead man's name for 6 weeks because my own one is buried. His wallet had ridden to the hospital with him and been inventoried under the name on the band he was wearing, which is to say, under the dead man's. License, Medicare card, $41, released with the deceased effects to the funeral home, and from there to next of kin. Everything else sat in a safe deposit box the bank drilled, and sealed into an estate the day they were told he was dead. He did not own one piece of paper in this world with his own name on it. On the 5th of June, Hollis fell in his own side yard and fractured his hip. The ambulance brought him into Havasu Regional at 11 at night, into an emergency department working a heat surge, 22 people on gurneys in the hallway. 40 minutes later, they brought in a man named Hollis Ostrom, 81, collapsed at the boat launch. No family, no wallet, 2 men, same first name, 6 letters apart on the last. One tired hand at 2 in the morning. On the 8th of June, Hollis Ostrom died, and the chart said Ostrander. On the 9th, the county called the emergency contact that had been sitting in Hollis Ostrander's file for 30 years. And a man walked into that cooler, looked down at a face that was not the man who raised him, and had about 4 seconds to decide what to say. He said yes. Verlie got Hollis onto the couch, and she went and found the shutoff and turned on the outside hose and let it run until it went cold, and she filled every container in that house. He watched her carry the last one in. When she set it down, he took her wrist and turned the hand over before she could pull it back. The dish towel had come off somewhere in the yard. Both palms were open across the base of the fingers, raw, weeping, worked through by 3 hours and 40 minutes of plywood. You did that on my walkway. I did it on your walkway for bread I already knew you didn't have. She took her hand back. So we're square. Hollis looked down at her shoes, the split one, the fishing line holding it shut, and made a sound in his chest that never turned into a word. It was a while before he tried again. When this is over, he said, I'm going to owe you a good deal more than a piece of bread. When this is over, I'm going to hold you to it. I called, he said, before she could ask why he hadn't. 22nd of June. Used a stranger's phone 2 streets over. Told them I was an old man with no water. They came, 2 deputies and a medic, and they ran my name in the truck. He got his breath. Then they stood in my own doorway and told me I was deceased, and asked me who I really was. I could not answer that. So they left. You don't call twice. Then she asked the question anybody would ask. So who was it? Who identified you? The old man turned his head away from her, toward a wall with nothing on it. Doesn't matter. It's the only thing that matters. It matters to me, he said, which is why I'm not saying it in front of the window. She was still trying to get around that when the shouting started outside. Junie Fentress was 68, 3 houses down, and the only person on that street who did not leave for the summer, which made her the closest thing that block had to a witness and to a newspaper. She stood at the end of the driveway with a phone up in landscape, filming, loud enough to carry. I see you. I see you in there. Junie's voice went up and cracked. That man died in June. I went to the service. There were 100 people at that service, and I sat in the 3rd row. Verlie came out onto the cleared walkway, hands still wrapped in the dish towel. Ma'am, he's inside. He's alive. He needs a doctor, and he needs a working phone. Don't you tell me about that man. Junie was walking backward, filming and dialing at once. You people come through in the summer when the houses are empty. You go in through the sliders, and now you stand there telling me a dead man is alive. On his own porch? With his own gate tagged. 2 more neighbors had come out by then. A man across the street was filming from his garage. Not one of those people was lying. Junie Fentress believed she had buried her neighbor. She had been to the service. She had cried at it. Weldon Stroud spoke for 11 minutes about the man who took him in at 14. And he had cried too. And everybody there had seen him do it. So when a woman with split shoes and towel-wrapped hands stood on that walkway and said the old man was alive, she was not a witness. She was a looter. I'm calling the sheriff. Junie screamed. I am calling them right now. Verlie ran. She hated herself the whole 4 blocks and ran anyway, because she had a bench warrant in Mojave County, and every deputy who rolled up on that address was going to ask her one question first, and the answer put her in a cell in Kingman while an old man cooked at 108 degrees. The deputies came that afternoon. Hollis did not open the door, because he knew by then what happens when a man with no name opens a door to a uniform. They found no forced entry. They put a second notice on the gate. They left. Junie watched every minute of it. Then she called the one man on that street everybody called when something went wrong. That was the trap. The only way to prove Hollis was alive was to stand at a government counter beside him, and every one of those counters has a camera and a name field. Social Security, the recorder, the courthouse, the substation. The moment Verlie gave her real name, she was gone. She tried anyway. Next morning, she stood in line at the Social Security office on Mesquite for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and at the window she asked the only question she had. No name given, no form filled out, nothing that would put Verlie Threadgill into a computer. If a living person got marked deceased by mistake, how does he undo it? The woman behind the glass had answered this before, and it showed. He has to come in person. Photo identification. Or 2 witnesses who can swear to his identity, and those witnesses need government-issued ID of their own. He doesn't have identification. His account's closed. His documents were in a safe deposit box the bank sealed. Then he needs the witnesses. What if a witness can't come in? The woman looked at her through the glass, really looked, and dropped her voice under the counter noise. Then I'd tell that witness that whatever they think is chasing them out there is smaller than what happens to a man with no benefits and no power in July. That's not policy. That's just me. Verlie stood in the shimmer coming off that parking lot and did the arithmetic on her own life. She went back that evening with a bag of ice she paid $4 for, more than a third of everything she had. There was a truck in the driveway, a clean white pickup with Stroud Marine on the door in navy blue. The man leaning against it was 46, in a golf shirt, and he had brought groceries. Real ones, for bags on the tailgate, a case of water, a battery fan still in the box. There she is. Weldon smiled at her like they had met before. He had a warm, unhurried face. He used people's names constantly. He made you feel picked out of a crowd. Junie told me about you. Verlie, right? My grandmother was a Verlie. You're the one who identified him. I am. He said it immediately, and that was the thing about Weldon. He never dodged. He absorbed. I made the worst mistake of my life in that room. Hollis raised me. From 14. My mother left me at a marina, and that man came and got me. His eyes went red on cue and stayed there. I'm fixing it. I've got an attorney in Kingman on it right now. These things take weeks. He handed her the case of water off the tailgate, in full view of Junie, who stood in her own driveway watching. Verlie saw Junie's whole face soften. He was not hiding. He stood in that driveway with groceries where everybody could see him, and by dinner the whole street knew Weldon had it handled. He walked Verlie to the end of the drive, out of Junie's hearing, and his voice never lost its warmth. I want to help you too, he said. Junie mentioned your car got taken. That's brutal. Sit down with me tomorrow, 10 o'clock, my office on the channel. Let me see what I can do. She should have known then. Part of her did. But she had $11, a warrant, and a mattress in a storage unit. And when a man offers you a chair in an air-conditioned room, you sit in the chair. Stroud Marine sat on the channel with a view of the London Bridge. Leather seats, cold air, a bowl of butterscotch candy. Weldon slid a manila folder across the desk before she had finished sitting down. Open it. Inside, a payoff statement from the collection firm in Kingman for $1,180 plus court costs plus interest. Total, $5,612.40. Underneath it, a second sheet on a lawyer's letterhead. A motion to quash the bench warrant on a showing of paid judgment. Underneath that, a receipt from the tow yard on McCulloch, already paid in full that morning in cash. Not an offer. A thing he had gone and done. Her car and everything in it, birth certificate, social security card, her mother's photographs in a shoebox, sitting 2 miles away with her name on the release. Verlie looked at 4 years of her life, sitting in a folder on a desk. What do I have to do? Nothing. Weldon opened his hands. That's the beautiful part, Verlie. You don't have to do a thing. You just don't do one thing. He leaned back. You never met that old man. You never went in that house. You don't talk to anybody about the 9th of June. My attorney handles it through channels, and you go get your car and your mother's pictures and go have a life. He turned a framed photograph around on the desk. A shop floor, 11 people in navy polo shirts lined up in front of a boat. That's my payroll. 11 families in this town. 3 of them have been with me since I was 26. His voice never lost the warmth. It never even got faster. You think I wanted $1 of that money? I'm putting it back. Every cent. The season turns in October, the inventory moves, I put it back. And Hollis gets every penny he is owed. And the only difference is that 11 people keep their jobs, and I don't spend 9 years in Florence. He opened his hands. Tell me what's evil about that. Say it out loud and I'll listen. The air conditioning hummed. Outside the window, the bridge sat in the sun with the water moving under it. And if I say no? He smiled, and it was still warm. That was the horror of it. It stayed warm. Then I'd worry about you, Weldon said. Because right now you're a stranger with a record who was found inside a deceased man's house, and I'm the man who buried him. Who do you think this town believes? She took the folder. She stood up with 4 years of her life under her arm, and she thanked him, and she walked out of that cold office into the white heat of the lot, and got about as far as the boat trailers before she stopped. because she had one question left and it would not sit down. If it was an honest mistake, if a grieving man had made the worst error of his life in a cooler in June, then why did fixing it require her silence? You don't buy a witness to an accident. You only buy a witness to a crime. She walked back in the worst heat of the day and asked Hollis one question. What does that man lose if you turn out to be alive? The old man was a long time answering. In 1988, he had taken out a life insurance policy and named the 14-year-old boy he brought home from a marina as the beneficiary and never changed it, because you do not change a thing like that. $250,000. And Ozella, who had carried certified mail up the steps of Stroud Marine for 11 years, could have told anybody what those envelopes from the lender in Phoenix meant. Weldon was upside down on a floor plan loan against 40 units nobody was buying. 90 days from losing the business his whole reputation stood on. Then the county called him about a body. He walked into that room and he looked down and he knew inside 2 seconds that it was not Hollis. He knew it. And he had about 4 seconds to decide whether to be the man who said no. Which meant that if that policy had already paid out, the signature on the informant line was a felony in his own handwriting. And the only thing standing between him and it was an old man staying dead. Had the money moved yet? Verlie could not know. Neither could Hollis. That was the one fact nobody outside Stroud Marine could reach. He was not protecting a mistake. He was protecting a sentence. Verlie walked back into that office, put the folder on the desk, and said 6 words. I'm going to take him in. Weldon did not shout. He did not stand up. He picked up his phone before she had reached the door, and that was the sound she carried out with her, a man dialing. They went next morning to the federal building on Mesquite, the only place that could switch the record back on. She got him there in a borrowed wheelchair with a bag of ice against his neck, and he sat in that line an hour and 50 minutes without one word of complaint. When they called him up, he put both hands on the counter and said his name out loud, and then he lifted his arm and showed them the only identification he had left in the world. The plastic band, filthy, 6 weeks old, hanging loose over his thumb. Ostrom H. The clerk read it. Then she looked at her screen and her face did something, and she said she'd be right back, and she did not come back. 2 deputies came instead. Because 40 minutes earlier, a respected marine dealer and chamber board member had called the fraud line and reported, with real grief in his voice, exactly this. A confused transient was using his late guardian's identity to reopen closed federal accounts, coached by an unhoused woman with a record found inside the deceased residence. So a 79-year-old man walked into a government building to prove he was alive, and they arrested him for pretending to be himself. They took the wristband off him and bagged it as evidence of the false identity. Verlie stood across Mesquite Avenue in 119 degrees and watched them wheel him out, and she could not cross that street. She had a warrant. Crossing that street meant 2 of them in cells, and nobody left outside to do anything about it. Then she turned and ran on ruined feet 11 blocks to the post office annex on Lake Havasu Avenue. Ozella came out to the loading dock with her route sheet still in her hand and listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. Then she said, "Get in the truck." "You said stay off that street." "I said a lot of things when I thought this was a trespass." Ozella already had her keys. Federal employee. Photo credential. 11 years on that route. And a scan log that says the stop on his address went in on the 16th of June. They want 2 witnesses with government identification. She pulled the door open. "I'm one." "Who's the second?" Ozella put the truck in gear and looked straight ahead. "The woman who buried him." Junie opened her door and did not want to hear it. She said she had been to the service. She said it 3 times, louder each time, and the 3rd time her voice went thin, because Ozella was standing on her step in a federal uniform, route log open, pointing at a line. "Junie, you told me at this door on the 17th that you hadn't seen him since he fell. You didn't see a body. You saw a service." Ozella tapped the page. Weldon Stroud spoke for 11 minutes, and there was no open casket. Was there? Junie stood in her doorway for a long moment with her hand over her mouth. "I filmed her," she said. "I filmed that woman on his walkway, and I sent it to Weldon, and I told the whole street she was a looter." Her chin went. "Oh, my lord." She was hauling that man's silt out in a bucket. They needed one more thing, and Verlie could not be the one to go get it. So Ozella went to the county counter on her lunch hour. The clerk was Marvetta Sowell, 35, and she had been at that counter 9 years, and she had seen this exact thing one time before. "I can't hand you a certified copy," Marvetta said. "Arizona restricts these. Family, executor, or a court order, and you're none of the three." Then she turned her screen a few degrees, which she was not supposed to do either. "But I can read you the informant line, because you'll find it out anyway. Weldon Stroud," signed in his own hand. Ozella wrote it down. "And this number here is the decedent's hospital account." Marvetta laid her pen against the glass. "You said the living man is wearing a band. What number is on his?" They bagged the band. "It's in evidence." "Then it's on the property receipt they handed him. And he can request his own hospital record any day of the week, because he is the patient." She glanced at the line building behind Ozella and dropped her voice. "2 admissions, same night, 1 department. If those account numbers are different, then there were 2 men in that building. Only one of them is dead. And everything else in this county is just paper that has to catch up." They were different. Hollis Ostrander, admitted 2311, June 5th, hip fracture. Hollis Ostrom, admitted 2352, June 5th, cardiac arrest. 2 account numbers 41 minutes apart, and a band swap in a hallway with 22 people on gurneys. Ozella and Junie signed the identity affidavit on a Tuesday morning, side by side. The woman who had warned Verlie off that street, and the woman who had called her a looter. It took 9 days to unkill him. Medical records confirmed the accounts on a Thursday. The hospital's risk office notified the county on Friday. The county filed an amended certificate that next Wednesday. Social Security switched him back on 8 days later, and a supervisor came out from behind the glass to apologize to a 79-year-old man in a lobby chair. He told her it was not her fault. It was one tired hand at 2 in the morning, and everybody after that just believed the paper. The charges against him were dropped the day the amended certificate landed. Nobody had to argue it. The document simply stopped being true. And on the 9th day, the insurer's file finally answered the one question Verlie had never been able to reach. The check had cleared on the 26th of June. Weldon Stroud paid down his floor plan loan on the 30th. He had never been waiting on October. He had already spent it. That same document finished him. Nobody confronted him. No scene on the channel. No shouting in the lot at Stroud Marine. The insurer's recovery unit does not shout. They received the amended certificate through the routine county notification. They opened a file, and they pulled the informant line, because on that line in his own handwriting sat the signature of the man who told the county a stranger's body was Hollis Ostrander, and who cashed $250,000 17 days later. He was destroyed by a form, exactly like the old man was. The floor plan lender called the note. The chamber board asked for his resignation by email, which is how those things actually happen. And Junie, who had sat in the 3rd row and cried at that service, walked into the sheriff's substation on her own 2 feet and gave a statement, who had told her the old man was dead, and who had asked her for that video. But there was one debt left outstanding in Lake Havasu City, and it had nothing to do with insurance money. A woman had stood at a front door in 118 degrees and named her price, and the old man had never paid it. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning before the heat came up, 4 people stood on the London Bridge. Hollis was 22 in 1970 when he worked the reassembly crew, a kid on a laborer's wage, on a bridge England had declared finished and sold off for scrap, taken apart stone by stone, every stone numbered, so it could be put back together, and rebuilt out here in the desert where nobody believed it belonged. 2 men from that crew were still alive, and they came. The 3 of them put their hands flat on the stone, found the numbers still cut into it, and said his name out loud on the bridge he built, which is a thing no computer in Arizona had been willing to do in 9 weeks. Ozella hauled the tub of held catalogs out of the annex and set it down at his feet on that bridge, a month of a dead man's mail, and told him his route was open again. Then she handed Verlie an envelope. A custodial opening at the annex, no vehicle required, and she had already put in a word. And Hollis reached into a paper sack and took out a loaf of bread from the bakery on Swanson, still warm, and held it out to a woman with scars across both palms. "You cleared my walkway," he said. I owe you a piece of bread. Verlie started laughing, and it fell apart in the middle of it. You said the price was a piece. His voice cracked exactly as it had in that doorway the first time. I'm giving you the whole loaf. And that house has 3 bedrooms and 1 old man in it. And I'd take it as a kindness if you'd quit sleeping in that unit. She did not answer for a while. She stood on a bridge that had been declared finished, sold for scrap, and rebuilt anyway, and she held the bread with both ruined hands. Now here's the question I want you to answer, and I want you to pick a side. No fence-sitting on this one. Weldon put a folder in front of Verlie that would have paid her judgment, killed her warrant, and handed back her mother's photographs. For years of her life, handed back to her, for staying silent about a stranger she had known for days. If that folder had been slid across the table to you, with your name on the warrant and your mother's picture sitting in that tow yard, would you have walked out of that office like Verlie did? Or would you have taken the deal? Tell me the truth in the comments. Now it sounds good. The truth.